Dr. Greene, take it away.
All right, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. This evening, of course, we began with a wonderful selection from Cab Calloway, which was made during the time period we're talking about this evening, from 1895 until 1945, a momentous time in the history of South Carolina, the nation, and indeed the world. Now, today is April 5th, 2021, and today is actually historically momentous for two reasons. Of course, yesterday was not only Easter, but also the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, fighting for both civil rights, human rights, and labor rights, which we'll be touching on this evening in today's class. And today is also the birthday of South Carolina great Robert Smalls, who was born on this date back in 1839. Now, I want to begin today's class with some words from Robert Smalls when he was at the 1895 Constitutional Convention, with which we'll start this evening. Now, that convention, of course, was designed to create a new state constitution, which would wipe away most of the progressive gains of the old 1868 Constitution. But Smalls was one of only 5 African-American representatives at that convention in 1895. And he warned the conventioneers that Ben Tillman's plans to create a new, more restrictive constitution designed to break the back of Black voting and political rights was going to be a disaster for the state. So I want to start off tonight's class by reading a few words of wisdom from Robert Smalls. He said, quote, "I was born and raised in South Carolina, and today I live on the very spot on which I was born, and I expect to remain here as long as the great God allows me to live. And I will ask no one else to let me remain. I love the state as much as any member of this convention because it is the garden spot of the South." Later on in the same speech, he says, "Mr. President, this convention has been called for no other purpose than the disenfranchisement of the Negro. Be careful and bear in mind that the elections which are to take place early next month in very many of the states are watching the action of this convention, especially on the suffrage question. Remember that the Negro was not brought here of his own accord. I found my reference to a history in the Congressional Library in Washington, D.C., that he says that in 1619, in the month of June, a Dutch man of war landed in Jamestown, Virginia, with 15 sons of Africa aboard. At the time, Miles Kendall was deputy governor of Virginia. He refused to allow the vessel to be anchored in any of her harbors. But he found out after his order had been sent out that the vessel was without provisions and the crew was in a starving condition. He countermanded his order and supplied the vessel with the needed provisions in exchange for 14 Negroes. It was then that the seed of slavery was planted in the land. So you see, we did not come here of our own accord. We were brought here in a Dutch vessel, and we have been here ever since. The Dutch are here and are paying a very large tax and are controlling the business of Charleston today. They are not to blame and are not being blamed." And he goes on to finish up his speech by saying the following, which I think is a great segue into tonight's lesson. "I appeal to the gentleman from Edgefield to realize that he is not making a law for one set of men. Some morning you may wake up to find that the bone and sinew of your country is gone. The Negro is needed in the cotton fields and the low country rice fields. And if you impose too hard conditions upon the Negro in this state, there will be nothing else for him to do but to leave. What then will you do about your phosphate works? No one but a Negro can work them, the mines that pay the interest on your state debt. I tell you, the Negro is the bone and sinew of your country, and you cannot do without him. Now, Mr. President, we should not talk one thing and mean another. We should not deceive ourselves. Let us make a constitution that is fair, honest, and just. Let us make a constitution for all the people, one we will be proud of and our children will receive with delight," end quote. Unfortunately, the 1895 convention did not heed Robert Smalls' words. And that, in essence, is tonight's lesson. How much Robert Smalls tried to warn the convention in 1895 of the error of their ways, and how much, for all intents and purposes, South Carolina has been paying the price ever since. All right. Now, before I dive into tonight's lesson, Brett, do you have any words you wanted to add as well?
Just that this is a really significant portion of South Carolina's history because it's today's history. I mean, it is the Constitution, it's the laws we're living under now. And when you understand how deeply woven white supremacy is into the fabric, into the culture, into the mores, it makes our job harder. That's what it amounts to. But we need to know that stuff in order to make it work.
Definitely agreed there, Brett. And before we get into the tonight's lesson, make sure that if you are posting anything in the chat, that your comments, your questions do relate directly to tonight's presentation. All right. And I'll try to set aside some time at the end of class around 8:10 or 8:15 or so to answer as many questions as I can. But of course, as questions come to you during our conversation this evening, please feel free to post them in the chat as well. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started.
Dr. Greene, I thought of something I want to point out to people.
Sure.
When you were talking about Robert Small reaching the end of his life, making that statement there at the convention, that the president you're referring to is the president of the convention.
Mm-hmm.
But that when I realized that when Robert Smalls died, that Modjeska Simkins, who I spent the last 20 years of her life with, Modjeska was 15 when Robert Smalls died. And so this woman that I knew could have known this guy that was a Civil War hero. It just shrunk history for me and made me realize this is not ancient history. And that's yet another myth that has been inculcated into our brains here in the state education system. And so we're still digging out. We're still just kind of new on this turf, on this land here. And it hasn't been that long. And I just want to make that connection that rang a bell for me when I realized that Miss Simkins was alive when Robert Smalls died in Beaufort.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And that is, again, you're exactly right. This is not ancient history, and we're going to go ahead and dive into it right now. So one of the things you're going to see in tonight's conversation about the history of this state from 1895 until roughly 1945 is how much so many of the things we've been discussing so far, whether it's racism and segregation, the labor movement, women's rights, and politics, how they all tie together in some very interesting ways to really set the stage for South Carolina as we know it today in 2021. Many of the things we're going to talk about this evening are still issues the state is faced with, and I would argue the entire nation is faced with even now in the early 21st century. And so to get us started off here, of course, let's remember that one of the big movers and shakers of South Carolina politics in this time period is, of course, our good dear friend, Ben Tillman. Now, by 1895, of course, the year that Constitutional Convention I just mentioned was held, Tillman was moving from the governor's mansion in Columbia to the halls of the Senate in Washington, D.C. But of course, Tillman was still incredibly influential on the state's politics. Again, it was his really pushing for this new convention that helped set the stage for it in 1895. Now, of course, the Democratic Party at this time was the only game in town in South Carolina. The Republican Party thinks, again, that disenfranchisement of thousands of Black voters was moribund and incredibly weak at this point. But the Democratic Party still had its own divisions between conservatives and reformers. And we'll talk a little more about that this evening. But Tillman is able to really push forward for this constitutional convention, which, among other things, is really an attempt to really destroy Black voting power in South Carolina. Now, from 1890 until roughly 1908, across the former Confederacy, all of those southern states put into place new state constitutions. And all of those constitutions have the exact same goal: to break the back of Black political power as quickly, as decisively, and as thoroughly as possible. The process begins in Mississippi in 1890 and spreads throughout the South throughout the 1890s and going to the first decade of the 20th century. Now, what's important to note, and I think this is very important for us thinking in the here and now with voting rights laws being passed in states right bordering us, right next to us. The thing about these constitutions, especially when it comes to voting rights, is that they are not mentioning race explicitly. Remember, there is by this point the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which says you cannot discriminate on voting rights based on race, creed, or color. Of course, that amendment does not mention gender for obvious reasons, but the new state constitutions across the South are able to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of Black voters, along with quite a few white voters as well, because of legislation like this. Now, in the new state constitution of 1895, amongst other things that it includes, and this is also listed on the Modjeska Simkins website, school website as well, you have to have the following things. You have to own at least $300 worth of property to be able to vote. You have to pass a literacy test, and you have to pay a poll tax at least 6 months in advance of the election. So, for example, if you're going to go vote in the November election in South Carolina, you have to pay your poll tax by May, which is not exactly a good thing because you're in the middle of growing season. It's likely you don't have the money quite yet. And so it's going to be very difficult for you to decide between feeding your family or paying a poll tax. Also, with literacy tests, even if you were well educated, if you were African American, there's no guarantee you can pass that test because the folks at your voting location may decide to give you the hardest possible test. And even if you pass that one, they can still say, well, you didn't actually pass the test. What's interesting to note, in addition to Black voting power declining rapidly after 1895, is that across the South in the 1890s, voter turnout crashes across the board. The South is, for all intents and purposes, the least small d Democratic part of the United States from 1890 until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I would argue that even today, we're still struggling with the legacy of a disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of voters all across the South. Now, part of this is also being done because of the concern of the rise of the populist movement, which, as you might recall from our previous class, was the last attempt in the 19th century to build a genuine biracial coalition of Black and white voters that resisted the rule of bourbon Democrats and the like. Brett, go ahead, please.
Dr. Greene, when you mentioned the difficulties of people voting in the Constitution, when I went to register to vote in South Carolina when I was 21 at the courthouse in Richland County, you had to be 21 to vote then, by the way. Mm-hmm. There was something I had to sign to say that I was not guilty of miscegenation, and I questioned whether I was ideological in support of it or practiced it, and he called the police. That meant that if you had a mixed race relationship, you couldn't vote in South Carolina. We've been moving things out of the Constitution that were prima facie unconstitutional for decades now. That question went on the ballot for the people to vote on it in 2000. 36% of the people wanted to leave it in. And so I just wanted to do a footnote there that progress is extremely slow here in South Carolina. Excuse me.
Oh, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think saying progress is slow in South Carolina is putting it a bit mildly, to say the least. But you're exactly right. And again, this Constitution is, with some changes, of course, the one that our state is still governed by today. Now, I wanted to mention for a second the legacy of Ben Tillman, because we've talked about Ben Tillman in the last couple of classes. And it's important to note that folks like Strom Thurmond and James Burns, the latter of whom we'll talk much more about in this evening's class, they got some of their cues from Ben Tillman. They understood the importance of demagoguery. They understood the importance of utilizing white supremacy to their advantage. They understood the importance of how to cultivate a voter base in South Carolina based on fear, intimidation, and hearkening back to a white supremacy that linked all white South Carolinians together, regardless of class. Again, Thurmond and Burns, they both grew up listening to Ben Tillman. I believe Thurmond was actually in attendance of some of Ben Tillman's speeches. They both understood and took their cue from how Tillman built voting power in South Carolina. And again, I think it's worth noting that Tillman, Thurmond, and Burns, all at various points in their lives, served in the United States Senate. And it's also very difficult to think about the history of segregation and racism in this country on both a state level and a national level without talking about these three men. So I wanted to lay the groundwork for the next couple of classes too, because Burns will be very important this evening, and Old Strom will be very important next couple of classes as well. Now, the context of all of this, and again, I think to the question Miko has in the chat about positive things to say about Strom Thurmond, I'll touch on that in the classes to come. But this is, again, I think, part and parcel of why the Modjeska Simkins School is so important. Because, again, I think with Strom Thurmond especially, some of the things that he stood for have been a bit sanitized because of the demoralization of Thurmond and the like. But we'll definitely touch on that in the next few classes to come, too. Now, the thing about South Carolina that I also want to point out this evening is that what's happening in the state and what's happening in the South, broadly speaking, all of this is happening in a national and global context where white supremacy or ideas about the supremacy of white people, they are very much on the rise globally. In Africa, of course, you have the scramble for Africa, where European nations are carving up the continent of Africa with no sort of recognition of the rights of peoples living on the continent of Africa. Of course, most of Asia is being divided amongst the European powers and Japan as well. And in the United States, you're seeing this idea of white supremacy really crystallize in the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896. Now, the Plessy v. Ferguson decision essentially argues that the idea of separate but equal, that is, having separate facilities for African Americans and white Americans, is perfectly legal according to the Constitution, as long as those facilities are equal in what they can do, as long as they are equal in quality, and so forth. Now, spoiler alert for those in the class, as you might already guess if you don't already know, separate but equal was embraced by the South, but really only the separate part was actually embraced. The equal part, not so much, but we'll touch on that more this evening as well. But again, I want you guys to understand the context of all this, that if you're fighting for human rights in South Carolina in 1896, you're not simply fighting against racism in the Palmetto State, nor are you merely fighting against racism in the Deep South. You're not even really fighting against white supremacy in America. You are faced with a global system of oppression that is as harmful and destructive to folks in Johannesburg, South Africa, or Nairobi, Kenya, or Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, or Havana, Cuba, as it is to folks in Orangeburg, South Carolina, or Charleston, South Carolina. It is, after all, but a local phase of a global problem. All right. Okay, and I guess to answer a couple of questions in the chat here, is this the same Burns from the State Hospital? I believe so. There are a lot of things named for James Burns in Columbia and across South Carolina. I know there's at least one building in USC's campus named after Burns as well. So again, this is kind of part and parcel of wrestling with these legacies. Omari's question, do you think the legacy of suppression is internalized and manifests in the 500,000 registered inactive Black voters? I would actually say yes. I think that part, but not entirely the reason for some of the lack of civic engagement in the South and in South Carolina in particular. That's certainly a part of it too. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep going. Now, the thing about segregation in South Carolina is that segregation in the state takes some time for folks to get used to. And I actually joked with my class from last week about this, because the Post and Courier in Charleston actually posted articles and opinion page editorials saying that they thought segregation was stupid. They were like, well, we've lived without it before. Why do we need it now? But nonetheless, across South Carolina, you do start to see segregation pop up in railroad coach cars, trolley cars, and in textile mills as well. Again, this process does not take place overnight, which I think should make us all consider the fact that if segregation did not rise up overnight instantly out of the ether, then certainly folks could argue in South Carolina the system could also be broken down and defeated over time too. So this is, I think, a good lesson for many of us who are interested in becoming activists either right now or down the road, that the systems of oppression we face today are not systems that were naturally built. They were built, which means they can be dismantled as well. However, this process of segregation is also incredibly important to think about in terms of how it was enforced via extra legal means, and most notably via lynchings. Now, on the Modjeska Simkins website, of course, there's a link to a New York Times page about lynchings across the South, which really shows just how widespread lynchings were across the former Confederacy. But in South Carolina, there were some particularly heinous lynchings, most notably the 1898 lynching of Fraser Baker. Now, Fraser Baker was an African-American man who was the Postmaster General in Lake City, South Carolina. For those who may not know, even after the collapse of Reconstruction, if there were Republicans in the White House running the federal government, they would give patronage jobs to their supporters across the country. In the Deep South, that meant some of those patronage jobs, like customs officials or postmasters and the like, would go to African Americans who were still stalwart supporters of the Republican Party. However, in Lake City, South Carolina, many of the white citizens of that town refused to accept mail from a Black man. And so they destroyed the post office in Lake City, forcing Fraser Baker to literally run the mail through his own house. And eventually, he and his family were attacked by a white mob in 1898. Fraser Baker was shot and killed, along with one of his young daughters. And the rest of Baker's family was forced to flee to Boston. Now, in Boston, they received financial aid from folks who were still believing in the idea of abolition and civil rights. And so they invited the Baker family to come up to Boston. And that family never really came back to South Carolina out of fear for their lives. Now, what makes the Fraser Baker case unique, as you may have gleaned from the Modjeska Simkins School website, is that although over 5,000 Black men and women were lynched between 1880 to 1950, only in rare instances, like the case of Fraser Baker, were federal officials lynched as well. Baker was only African American. He was a federal agent working for the post office. And so this forced the federal government to investigate the Baker case. Ida B. Wells Barnett, who many of you may know as a legendary crusader and journalist against lynchings and for civil rights, she led the charge in 1898 to launch a federal investigation into the lynching of Fraser Baker. Eventually, the federal government would investigate the case. They would try to pursue criminal proceedings, but they could never quite nail down a culprit and convict someone of this tragic murder. Now, what's interesting is that the Fraser Baker case in 1898 actually occupied front page headlines alongside the start of the War of 1898 between Spain and the United States. This is how big of a national story it was. Nonetheless, it also showed that lynchings were becoming a valuable tool in the larger toolbox and accessories of supporting and abetting white supremacy across the South. Now, in response to all this, I really do want to note that African Americans, both in South Carolina and across the country, are undergoing serious debates about how best to respond to the rise of what we now call Jim Crow segregation. Now, this debate was not an easy one because it seemed to many people that their options were, at best, limited. Now, in 1895, Frederick Douglass passes away, the great line of Black freedom and civil rights. And in his place, to many, it seems, rises Booker T. Washington, who by 1895 had gained national fame for his creation of the Tuskegee Institute, had gained fame on the lecture circuit as someone who spoke on behalf of Black economic rights, but doing so via what many would consider accommodationist means, making accommodations with the white power structure in the Deep South and across the country. Now, Washington perhaps is best known for his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, in which he promised to white and Black Southerners alike that in all things, whites and Blacks could be separate in terms of politics, in terms of culture, in terms of social understanding, etc., but they could come together economically to build what he and others called a new South, a South based less on slavery of the past and more on a vision of the future that included heavy industrialization and the like, a vision that would take several more generations to fully realize. Now, the thing about Washington, of course, is that while he was popular amongst many white Americans for his accommodationist stance and for essentially arguing that agitation for civil rights and political rights was folly, not every Black person in America agreed with Washington's approach. And of course, I think some of you are familiar with W.E. Du Bois being one of the stalwart critics of Washington. Of course, in books like Souls of Black Folk and other places, Du Bois was very critical of Washington's accommodationist approach. And Du Bois argued that it was impossible to agitate for economic rights and economic freedom without also agitating for civil rights and human rights at the exact same time. In fact, their biggest bone of contention was over education. I think some of you probably heard this before in your schooling, whether in K through 12 or college, but it's worth reiterating here because I actually would argue this debate's going on right now among colleges and universities. For Washington, his belief was Black Americans needed vocational training. They needed to be taught agricultural training and the like. That was the best way for freedom. Whereas Du Bois believed very strongly, what we would now consider a liberal arts or humanities education, that in order to fully fight for and embrace those civil and human freedoms that Du Bois and others believed in, African Americans had to have access to a quality education that included not only how to work and why to work, but included questions of how to live and why to live, and questions of how should we live in a society that is purportedly democratic like the United States. Now, these are questions that still really many African Americans, many Americans period, wrestle with today. Just look at debates about education budgets and the like right now. But what's important to note is that this debate between Washington and Du Bois and many other Black activists also included folks from South Carolina, like Archibald Grimke, who was one of the founding members of the Niagara movement in the 1900s, which would eventually lead to the creation of the NAACP by 1909. Now, Archibald Grimke was a relative of the Grimke sisters. He was someone who was eventually allowed to leave the state and pursue an education elsewhere. But Grimke, like Du Bois, believed wholeheartedly in the idea of agitation for civil rights and for Black political freedom. And so Grimke, along with Du Bois, many others, formed the Niagara movement, as I mentioned a moment ago, which was one of the early attempts to create a civil rights movement, which eventually led to the creation of NAACP in 1909. Now, we're going to come back to that in a moment because, of course, South Carolina is going to become a critical flashpoint in the NAACP's history in the years and decades to come. Now, one of the things that I always find rather fascinating about this period in American history, and I'm going to peel the curtain back as a historian for a second, is that when I'm often teaching this time period in US history courses or in South Carolina history courses, I find myself having to tell students, remember that all of these things, civil rights, women's suffrage, the progressive era, so on and so forth, Jim Crow segregation, they're all going on at the exact same time. And that's really important to note because questions of freedom and what we would now refer to as social justice are being talked about from a variety of different angles. Now, so far this evening, I've talked a great deal about race in South Carolina, but gender is equally important too, because during this time period, as Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois are debating questions about Black freedom, across the country, there's also this question of women gaining the right to vote. And the suffrage movement in the United States is struggling to gain steam at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Let's take a step back for just a quick second to 1869, when the 15th Amendment is being debated about expanding the right to vote. Now, in 1869, the supporters of the expansion of suffrage faced a difficult decision. There were some, like Frederick Douglass, who believed that it was incredibly important that Black men gain the right to vote before women of any race, because, as Douglass and others argued, Black men having the right to vote in the South was quite literally a matter of life or death. While many proponents of women's suffrage, like Susan B. Anthony and others, argued, well, granting women the right to vote is, in our minds, equally important as well. But what everyone agreed on, especially in the Republican Party, was that granting Black men and women regardless of race the right to vote at the same time was a non-starter. And ultimately, Black men gaining the right to vote is what's going to happen by 1870. Now, many women's suffrage activists in the 1870s realized and argued that this is going to set the movement back for some time. And so it would not be, of course, until 1920 that women across the country gained the right to vote. Now, across the country, what's happening is that suffrage supporters are gaining steam in the West. For example, the newer states out West, like the Dakotas, Wyoming, etc., they vote to give women the right to vote first, primarily because their populations are much smaller and they want to maximize the voting power as quickly as possible. But in the South, the fight for the suffrage of women is a tough and tenacious one. And in fact, most Southern states do not ratify the 19th Amendment of the Constitution granting women the right to vote until decades after 1920. Now, in South Carolina, folks like Anita Pulitzer and others were very important in leading the suffrage movement in the Palmetto State. But you have to understand that in the South, there is this reluctance to expand the right to vote. And this is actually for one critical reason. Many anti-suffrage opponents are not just opposed to women's suffrage, they are also fearful of the possibility of granting Black women the right to vote in particular. And there are some suffrage advocates in the Deep South who are actually arguing in favor of women's suffrage because their argument is if you grant white women the right to vote in particular, we could be a useful bulwark against Black men voting at the same time. Now, this was not an argument that every suffrage proponent across the country utilized, but it was a powerful argument for women's suffrage in the Deep South that ultimately does not work to get the Southern states on board with suffrage. In fact, the main reason that suffrage eventually comes to pass by 1920 is that women's rights advocates use American entry into the Great War to argue that if we're going to fight for democracy abroad, then it might make some sense to expand that same democracy at home. But even with those arguments in place, even with states like New York by 1917, granting women the right to vote, even with the efforts of folks like Anita Pulitzer, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, many others, it's still a very close run thing. The 19th Amendment is adding the Constitution. In fact, it comes down to Tennessee in a story that has somewhat become part of legend, that in Tennessee, the state legislature in 1920 was debating granting or passing the 19th Amendment. And it was the last state that needed to vote on it in order for it to be ratified. And according to lore, and we have some evidence that this actually happened, the legislature in Tennessee was deadlocked. But then one person changed his vote from against the proposal to for the amendment. And he said it was because his mother sent him a telegram and asked her son to go ahead and vote yay on the 19th Amendment. And so it came to pass. Now, for those of us who study the history of the suffrage movement and then also the Equal Rights Amendment movement afterwards, you might understand that the process for ratifying an amendment can take decades. It can take sometimes even centuries. And certainly with the battle for women's rights in American history and the history of South Carolina, what you see is that the American South has been incredibly reluctant to support women's rights, whether it's 19th Amendment or the Equal Rights Amendment, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks as well. So again, folks like Anita Pulitzer were facing an uphill battle in South Carolina on behalf of women's suffrage. But you want to keep in mind that these battles were part and parcel of these larger battles about freedom and equality that were still roiling the United States in the early 20th century. Okay. Now, speaking of women,
Robert, excuse me, it's worth pointing out that the Equal Rights Amendment has not been ratified in South Carolina.
No, it has not.
And that was introduced in what, 1970?
Well, actually, the ERA, it actually they first started debating it as soon as suffrage is passed. You start seeing it in both party platforms by 1940. And Brett, to your point, in the 70s, and we'll talk about this some more in a few classes from now, but spoiler alert, 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment gained steam because of the second wave of feminism. But in places like South Carolina, it faces considerable opposition. And that opposition buys enough time for individuals and national new right organizations to create bulwarks against that ERA that ultimately lead to its defeat by the early 1980s. Now, it's worth noting, by the way, the Equal Rights Amendment, as is the case with other constitutional amendments, it's not officially dead. An amendment doesn't just die. It basically lingers in the ether until it's finally ratified. So in the last few years, in fact, under the Trump administration, there were efforts by state legislatures to resume the ERA fight and to get more states on board. Only a few states away from getting ratified, just FYI.
In January of last year, Gilda Cobb-Hunter introduced again a resolution to pass the Equal Rights Amendment with the support of the conservative Republican fellow Tom Davis from Beaufort, and it didn't pass. And it was a kind of a race between Virginia and South Carolina to be the last state to have enough states to pass the amendment, and Virginia won.
Well, there you go. See, so again, as Brett mentioned earlier this evening, many of the things we're talking about in tonight's class are still with us today, whether figuratively or in some cases, quite literally. And that actually brings me to, okay, so real quick before I go on, I see a question. So when I was a child in the 1970s, he said there was a time limit on the ERA and we felt to meet it. Is that wrong? Actually, that's not wrong, Carrie, you're right. But let me explain this very quickly because this is actually an important point. So amendments to the Constitution technically don't have time limits. I'll give you an example. The most recent amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, which basically says that folks in Congress can't raise their pay until the next congressional session, that was ratified in 1992. It was first proposed in 1792 or thereabouts. So it was lingering for 200 years before it was finally passed. But with that time limit you're referring to, Carrie, that was a deal struck in the 70s by ERA supporters. They said, we'll go ahead and we'll allow Congress to set up what was essentially an artificial deadline by 1982, that if we don't get it passed by that point, we'll just drop the ratification fight. In fact, I think the original deadline was 1977 or 78, and they extended it to 1982. And by that point, Phyllis Schlafly and the New Right had rallied enough forces across the country to block further state governments from ratifying the ERA. And so that deadline of 82, it was a deadline set by Congress, but it was very much an artificial deadline. So theoretically, somebody, if enough states, like Brett said, go ahead and decide to ratify the ERA, it could then become part of the US Constitution. Oh, no problem at all. I mean, again, that's why we're here to talk about these kinds of questions. Now, speaking of women in South Carolina, it's also important to note that by the turn of the 20th century, there are many white women and quite a few black women as well working in textile mills across South Carolina. Textile mills, of course, being the backbone of the economies of North and South Carolina by the dawn of the 20th century. And this is creating, for all intents and purposes, for both men and women working in these mills, a new voting base that folks need to appeal to, especially in South Carolina. Now, the government and the economy of South Carolina are still very much locked in an agrarian society by the early 20th century. Despite the ideals of the New South, of a heavily industrialized South, championed by Booker T. Washington, Henry Grady, and many others, by about 1910, if you're living in South Carolina, chances are you're still living in a very, very rural environment. And it's folks like Cole BLEASE in particular who understand the importance of appealing to white mill workers as voters and appealing to them on a shared sense of racial solidarity. Now, Coleman Blease is one of those characters from South Carolina history about whom we don't quite hear enough about. But like Ben Tillman, Coleman Blease also helps to shape South Carolina for the next century to come. Now, Coleman Blease, he runs for governor in 1910 and wins election, again, appealing specifically to white working voters, mainly those in the textile mills. And he appeals to them based on ideals of race and racism. Now, when he becomes governor, he quickly clashes with progressives in the state government of South Carolina. And before you guys laugh, yes, there were progressives in the state government. Now, progressive in the 19 teens is not 100% the same thing as progressives in the 2010s or 2021. Certainly, the progressives in the United States in the early 20th century shared a few common things in common. They all believed in what they called good government, which was cleaning up corruption, which was creating primaries, which was creating a sense of a government that worked better for middle-class Americans, that responded to the issues of the slums and other blighted urban areas of the country. But progressives were certainly not unified on questions of race, for example. So, for instance, folks like Woodrow Wilson were progressives, but so were folks like W.E. Du Bois. And if you know anything about Wilson and Du Bois, then you know fairly quickly that those two men did not exactly see eye to eye on the issue of race. But Coleman Blease hates all those people. Instead, Blease is determined to keep in place a conservative state government in South Carolina that, while appealing to white textile mill workers and other working class voters in the state, is not going to provide social services and programs for them that could be advantageous and that are being added in other states across the country in the 19 teens. Now, this is going to come back to bite the state of South Carolina in the butt during the Great Depression. But Coleman Blease, like Ben Tillman, also leaves behind an incredible legacy of not only racism, but also political organizing in the state. Because again, other folks like James Burns, Codnett Smith, others we'll talk about this evening in classes to come, they're going to look at Coleman Blease as another example of how to win election in South Carolina. And the idea there is you've got to find ways to appeal to white voters based on a shared sense of racial solidarity and white racial supremacy. And again, as I mentioned before, this idea of the New South, you're starting to see really exemplified by folks like Woodrow Wilson, other Southerners who are determined to make the South a better place, but primarily a better place for white Southerners. And so Woodrow Wilson takes national the ideas of, say, Reconstruction being a disaster or a failure in South Carolina. Wilson, before he was president, before he was governor of New Jersey, he was a historian and political scientist, and he wrote books about Reconstruction. He himself grew up in South Carolina during the Reconstruction era. If you're in Columbia, there is the Woodrow Wilson House, which has been turned into a museum about Reconstruction. If you've not had a chance to visit it, I would highly recommend doing so, because the folks there have done a wonderful job of talking not just about Wilson as a child, but more important, talking about Columbia during the Reconstruction era and how Wilson, as he comes of age, begins to have ideas about Reconstruction as a failure, as an example of Black misrule run amok, that are going to shape his mind in his adulthood, and certainly during his presidency, when he leads the charge to segregate the federal government at every single level in Washington, D.C. in the 19 teens. One thing I wanted to add really quickly that I want to give some context for, oh, and by the way, it's the rise of the mill working class growth, the reason why textile mills segregated too. Jackie, yes, that is partially a reason why. Another reason is that what you see economically across the South, and really across the country by 1915, is this idea of saving the best jobs for white workers, whether it's textile mills in the South or Ford factories in Detroit. Now, the thing is, the textile mills in the South are segregated for this reason, but you do have attempts by Black businessmen to create Black-run textile mills in the Carolinas in North and South Carolina in the turn of the 20th century as well. Actually, my colleague at Clough University, Catherine Silva, is actually working on a book right now about those Black-run textile mills, which I think will actually further develop how we think about textile mills as a place not only of work, but also as a place of political solidarity in the early 20th century. But certainly the rise of those mills is certainly a reason why they're segregated. Because again, keep in mind, those textile mills are coming into fashion right as Jim Crow segregation itself is also coming into vogue across the South at the same time. So again, these two things happening in parallel with each other is not surprising at all.
The history of cotton in the South tracks the history of oppression. With the gin, the reduction of the need for people working in this, doing the cleaning of the cotton and putting them into the mills and segregation of the mills. And it's another story. We had people, we lived next to a mill and worked next to a mill in Columbia for a long time. And people had been there for 50 years. And remember that the distinction that they had is the white workers, they came in the front door.
Exactly. And so as you guys are seeing, right, this evening, we've already talked about the kind of takes talk where we are right now. We've talked a good bit about how race and gender and class, the holy trinity, if you will, amongst historians and scholars, how all of these things are actually shaping South Carolina at the turn of the 20th century. But I want to add a fourth one to this too, and that's imperialism. Now, I want to mention this briefly because this is going to give context for how we talk about James Burns later on tonight. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the United States starts to turn its eyes beyond North America into gaining possessions overseas. Now, oftentimes we talk about imperialism as a new thing. America was expanding overseas. But of course, if you ask indigenous folks, America was an expansionist nation from the get-go in North America. The difference now is the expansion is now taking place across oceans. And in the 1890s, of course, the Spanish-American War, in particular, the conquest of the Philippines, afterwards, the possession of several other islands after that, you do see the American South being brought into the fold in terms of reunifying the entire country, partially via warfare. So I have here the cover of Puck magazine from 1898 during the Spanish-American War, an actual photograph from the same time. And what you see here is that there's this idea the Spanish-American War is going to bring the country back together, that the wounds of the Civil War are finally being healed by American expansion abroad. And this actually happened quite literally. Leonard Wood, for example, who was a general in the Spanish-American War, actually saw service in the Civil War as well. So there's this idea that the South can be finally unified with the rest of the nation, partly through imperialism and warfare abroad, that having a short, glorious war against Spain might heal the wounds of the nation at home. And of course, next week, when we have our deeper dive discussion, we'll get a bit more into other ways that the country is trying to unify itself by ignoring race and racism and embracing ideas about the Civil War that are just blatantly untrue. But a part of this process is imperialism. All right. Okay. So let's keep going, because again, this process is really important. And I think, this is also a good point to point out that in the 20th century, the impulses for imperialism and U.S. foreign policy abroad are going to continue to take their cues partially from the South. White Southern leaders, by the way, I have to say this right now, white Southern leaders, whether it's James Burns, Strom Thurmond, John C. Calhoun before both of them, all of these folks and many more, as much as they had an eye on the South in terms of keeping segregation alive and keeping the races separate, they also had one eye on American power abroad, whether that was imperialism in the 1890s or the Cold War in the 20th century. And we'll come back to that lesson in a moment. But America's wars of imperialism and American entry into the Great War in 1917 are also going to shape the state of South Carolina in different ways as well. For example, you have the formation of Camp Jackson, now Fort Jackson, as a response to American entry in World War I. And as you can see from the photo, these are actually Black soldiers training at Camp Jackson. Now, during the Great War, thousands of Black men do serve under arms. Most of them are actually forced to serve in auxiliary units, but some of them do see combat, most notably the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th from New York, and also the 371st from South Carolina. They also see action in France as well. But, and I'm kind of speeding up through the Great War to get to the Red Summer, what's important to also note is that during the Great War years of 1917 through 1919, across the nation, there are a series of racial conflagrations that show that race relations in America are nowhere near being as pristine or as clean as President Wilson and others in the federal government would like to have the rest of the world believe. In 1917, of course, you have the East St. Louis riot, which was a disaster, dozens killed or wounded. And in 1919, you have the Red Summer, in which dozens of cities experienced race riots, race massacres, the worst of which was in Elaine, Arkansas, where over 200 African Americans were murdered for trying to create a labor union of sharecroppers. In Charleston, South Carolina, during the Red Summer, you have clashes between white and Black citizens, caused primarily by U.S. Navy sailors clashing with locals in the area of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, when I've taught the Modjeska School in the last couple of years, of course, talk about the Red Summer, I think folks have an understanding of how bad it was. Again, you have race riots from Washington, D.C. to Elaine, Arkansas, to Chicago, Illinois, to Charleston, South Carolina, all across Georgia, Florida, elsewhere. And then, of course, in 1918-19, you also have the influenza pandemic. Now, I think this class of students can relate to the Red Summer era in some rather interesting ways, because we've all lived through both, or are living through a pandemic, and last year, the return of Black Lives Matter protests across the country. In a sense, there are some rather interesting echoes between 2020 and 2021 with the world of 1918, 1919, minus, thankfully, a global war, although the year is still young. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the NAACP's formation in 1909. By 1917, you have the first chapters of the NAACP being formed in South Carolina, again, on the eve of American entry into the Great War. Those first chapters were centered around Charleston and Columbia. And by 1920, the NAACP in the Palmetto State has roughly 1,000 members, most of whom are centered in Charleston. Now, of course, that will change dramatically over time. But I point this out because what you're seeing in South Carolina in the first 2 decades of the 20th century is really a rebuilding of Black institutions, whether it's the creation of additional Black colleges like SC State in Orangeburg, or the strengthening of other institutions like the NAACP, the Black Church, and the like. All of these organizations and all of these institutions are going to play a pivotal role in saving the state from its own worst impulses during the course of the 20th century. Again, part of what we're doing here in Modjeska School is really emphasizing the importance of institution building amongst African Americans, amongst like-minded folks, regardless of color, race, creed, gender, etc. Again, building institutions is an important part of this history, and as we're seeing today, is an important part of keeping the fight going against these ills and these evils in South Carolina. Okay. And I think it's worth noting, because these are two individuals we're going to talk more about in classes to come, Septima Clark and Modjeska Simkins. These are two women who are coming of age in the early 20th century. They are coming of age right as the NAACP is trying to build itself into a force in South Carolina. They are coming of age as other Black institutions are also trying to increase their numbers in the early 20th century. And both Clark and Simkins, as young African-American women, are going to really come of age in a broader Black community that is trying to find ways to rally itself for what it sees as a long and difficult struggle ahead. Now, both of these women are going to play pivotal roles in tonight's class and in the next few classes as well. And I wanted you to keep in mind that they're both coming of age during the Red Summer, during this era of progressive rule in South Carolina, during an era where civil rights in the state are being pushed for through a variety of different methods. Now, I do also want to once again zoom out from South Carolina for a moment and talk a bit about the national context of the 1920s. Of course, the 20s in American history is often referred to as the Jazz Age or the Roaring 1920s, but unfortunately, it would be just as accurate to call it the age of the KKK. Now, in the 1920s, the Klan would reach heights that it has not seen since then, where it would have millions, yes, millions of members across the country. And some of the strongest KKK chapters were not in the South, but they were in fact in states like Indiana, Oregon, and elsewhere. But all across the country, for many white Americans, joining the Klan was the equivalent of joining the Elks or other fraternal organizations. It was just seen as the right thing to do. Because after all, in the 1920s, the Klan wasn't just a Southern-based organization. It wasn't just an anti-Black organization. It was a good 100% all-American organization that was in favor of Protestantism and against Catholicism, that was in favor of white Anglo-Saxon folks and deeply opposed to folks of Irish descent or Jewish descent or really anything that wasn't white Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. This is what made the Klan such a fearsome force in the 1920s. And as we're seeing today, it's going to really change the tenor and shape of white supremacy all throughout the country. Again, the Klan is giving white Americans across the country something to believe in, where the imagery of the Klan, as you can see in this picture here, is one that is not Southern so much as it's simply backing Uncle Sam and backing the fight against all these isms, including socialism and communism, that are seen as incredible threats to the American way of life in the 1920s. Now, before I get to labor and turn the floor over to Brett for a little bit about the textile strike of 1934, it is also worth noting that the nation's demographics are starting to change around 1915 or so with what's called the Great Migration, where thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of African Americans are going to leave the Deep South for better opportunities, both politically and economically, in the North and the West. Now, the American North is not exactly a paradise. It's not as though if you cross the Mason-Dixon line, everything's automatically better. On the contrary, Black Americans find serious challenges in places like Cleveland, Ohio, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Harlem, New York, or Boston, Massachusetts, and so on and so forth. But what they do find in the North and the West, the one thing, most important thing that they find in those places that they don't have in the South is the right to vote. Those northern and western states do not have the same kind of restrictive constitutions that the South does in terms of voting rights. And so in the 1920s and 30s, you begin to see more and more Black Americans exercising their right to vote in the North and the West. And that's going to have a serious impact on both the Republican and Democratic parties, which in those parts of the country now find themselves having to at least pay some lip service and attention to Black civil rights. That's going to, of course, change the course of American history in the decades to come. But of course, in the 1930s, the big story is the Great Depression. As I mentioned a moment ago, South Carolina is ill prepared for the Depression. Now, in fairness, no part of the country was prepared for the Great Depression, but it's worth noting that in the South, Black and white Southerners alike in the 1920s are already struggling economically. The collapse of the cotton crop in the 1920s, the arrival of the boll weevil insect that destroys many crops across the region in the 1920s, the fact that land prices crater in places like Florida in 1927-28. Essentially, across much of the South, many Southerners, regardless of race, are already living in Depression-like conditions. It just so happens by the early 1930s, the rest of the country has, unfortunately, caught up with them. But in the South, you are going to begin to see a greater labor militancy that is being given voice in places like Gastonia in 1929, North Carolina, and more broadly speaking, in the textile strike of 1934. And so I want to turn the floor over to Brett a little bit to talk about labor in the early 1930s, because this is going to help to set the stage for how South Carolina to this day is still struggling with the legacy of anti-labor governance and an anti-labor belief system. Brett, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. One of the really perplexing things in my life has always been the concept of the Right to Work Act. South Carolina is known as a right to work state. And what it means is it's the right to work for less with less protection. And then in the, it was the Great Textile Strike of 1934 was a nationwide strike. It was the first and largest general strike that came all the way from Maine to Georgia of textile industries, and it was the largest employer in the country. The United States of America was producing textiles that were going all around the world, and so that there was a showdown between the mill owners and the workers, and that at the time in the 1930s, a lot of the people that were doing organizing with the textile unions were left of center, and that the hysteria was whipped up about communism. And so if you were looking for rights at work, you were a communist. We'll see that trope played out to suppress Black liberation or workers' liberation or anything else they want to apply it to. But in the National Labor Relations Law was passed when Roosevelt was president, and it gave workers the rights to organize. And then after some back and forth and some sand being kicked by workers organizing, in 1947, we saw the Taft-Hartley Act come into effect. And what it did, actually, Truman became president when it was passed. Roosevelt vetoed it. And the US Congress overrode his veto because US Congress was a little more tied into the lobbying efforts and money from the big industries. And what it did was it created the right of workers to not participate in a union. And so there was a time, and there still is in some states that aren't right to work states, where they, if you were a majority of people in your shop voted to unionize, you were a union shop. And that when people came into work in that shop, they would become union members and pay dues and benefit from the negotiations that the labor management elected from the rank and file, the wages and safety issues that the union benefited from. So the Right to Work Act, that was part of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, also included an exclusion of people being union members that were communist. But the really deleterious impact of it was that in South Carolina, because we became a right to work state in 54, I think it was, that they said that you don't have to be a union member to benefit from the union. There's a term called free rider or freeloader, where if you're in a union shop in South Carolina and you bought all the propaganda from the company about how bad unions are, you don't have to be in the union to benefit from the negotiations the union makes. And so the right to work states were originally your basic Confederate states. And many people thought, as we moved forward in time and got more enlightened in our civilization, that that those old kind of Confederate notions about wage slavery would diminish. But we're seeing now the northern states passing right to work acts. And I know that Cecil Cahoon is with us, and he is a union organizer for the National Education Association. And Cecil, you want to throw in a couple words here?
Sure, I certainly will. You're exactly right that we became a right to work state in 1954. And unfortunately, Fritz Hollings at the time was the House Speaker pro tem under Speaker Solomon Blott. Sol Blott is the namesake today of the House office building. And it was Fritz Hollings who whipped the votes to pass right to work in April of that year, out of the House over into the Senate. And the story of that. It only takes 2 or 3 pages out of a book by John Cauthen, Cauthen, called his shoot, it's a biography, an authorized biography, by which I mean they spray a whole lot of lipstick on a pig. His task was greater, or something like that. His job was greater, or his burden was greater, talking about Saul Blott. And not only is well, I've lost my train of thought about well, I'm trying to think of the title of that biography of Saul Blott that explains it. It was not a slam dunk. Fritz Hollings had to work to get the votes to pass it out of the House to push it over to the Senate, because a lot of working folks were pressing their members of the House to oppose it. The labor unions that were active at the time in the early 1950s had done a good job of communicating to their folks what this would mean to labor strength in the state. And so there was an effort to defeat it in the House, but Fritz Hollings won out in the end. And as a matter of fact, Brett, you may know this better than I do. Once, while Jimmy Carter was running for the presidency, labor leaders across the country got a pledge from Jimmy Carter that if he were to be elected, that he would support a national right to organize, or a national what's the opposite of right to work? A national collective bargaining law, a federal collective bargaining statute. And in the spring of 1970,
that's something that Mr. Biden is talking about, talking up the rights of people to organize.
Exactly.
And
right.
this we don't need to get into a basic discussion about how fair it is to be able to balance labor and workers' rights to be able to make your country more productive. But the fact is that in 1934, that strike, with the killings in Hanea Path, they killed I think it was 7 people right off, wounded about 20 something. And I hope that you visited in the study guide some of the incredible scenes and imagery that is there. 10,000 people turned up for this funeral, and it was a really major event. And what happened was the fear of being killed if you worked for a union was so profound that people quit talking about unions. And I only realized that became a really significant element of my life in the grassroots organizing workshop that we started that preceded the network. We started in the mid-70s. In 1981, we became a union shop. We were the only union print shop in South Carolina. And that in the late 80s, we were approached by people that made the movie, The Uprising of 34. And that we will try and make that available to you. It's not very readily available, but it's a very powerful film, a lot of really incredible footage. But that the people that made this movie came into South Carolina and started doing interviews. And I didn't know about the Uprising of 34, and that there's nothing more revelatory in understanding how much this was suppressed than this fellow named Frank Beecham was the grandson of the mill manager. He grew up in Hanea Path. Frank didn't know that happened in Hanea Path. People just quit talking about being in a union because not only was it dangerous physically, it just became very dangerous in the socio-political world where you would lose your job. I mean, you were a communist, and that those tropes about being a communist, and it used to be different elements about people didn't understand that they're oppressed until people from the north came down and told them. And so it was like these people coming down, these union organizers coming down telling our workers are oppressed. And so that outside agitator type of thing is something we see in a generational aspect over different issues, different races, different jobs. And it's something that we as organizers need to be mindful of. But the anti-union attitude in South Carolina is woven deeply into the fabric and into the laws. And there's more to read after our study guide, but this is something that we're a union shop. South Carolina Progressive Network has always been a union shop, and that we believe that the workers need a right to organize. The bosses are organized. They've got the Chamber of Commerce, the Manufacturers Association. They're the biggest lobbyists. And the reason that our fight against COVID is being so poorly organized is because of the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. And so everything that is touching our lives goes back to money, and the money that people make in manufacturing or distribution, et cetera, and the people that try to organize. I haven't heard whether Amazon got organized in Alabama or not. Amazon's the biggest company in America now, and the workers are trying to organize. So, Robert, that's enough for that right now. So take us on into the 1940s.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think one of the central lessons of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights is that how much of this history is not forgotten so much as it is intentionally hidden by the powers that be, whether it's this history or other histories like Reconstruction, for example. And to Brett's point and Cecil's point about the bargaining, I want to read a quick quote from a good friend of the working class, Warren Buffett, who once said, and I quote, "There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning." And so with that thought in mind, I do want to finish up the 30s actually by talking about the intersection of race and class that you saw more and more during the Great Depression. Now, certainly you saw this in things like, for instance, W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, in which he used a Marxist framework to understand the Reconstruction era. There's actually a chapter in that book called The Black Proletariat in South Carolina, for example. You have more and more African Americans looking towards the Communist Party of the United States of America, the CPUSA, as a potential place for organizing against both racism and class warfare in America during the Great Depression. Because again, during the Depression era, there are more Americans asking questions about capitalism, saying, well, if this is the best capitalism can do for us, the Great Depression, then maybe the alternatives aren't so bad after all. And entering into that framework, so to speak, is, of course, the creation of things like the National Negro Congress, which was formed in 1936. And I want to bring it up now because for our next class, not for the deep dive, but the class after that one, we're going to talk about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, what folks like Brett and others have called the original SNCC, that was formed in 1937. But the National Negro Congress was an organization that was built by folks, some of whom were communists themselves or aligned to the Communist Party, who deeply believed that the best course of action for African Americans across the country was to create organizations that were dedicated to fighting against the evils of both racism and capitalism. And again, this is going to become an issue of tension amongst many civil rights leaders, some of whom are looking at building a civil rights movement like those in NAACP, while others, like in the NNC, for example, are thinking of a more broader-based human rights movement, that they're trying to take into account issues of class, issues of gender, and the like, because they believe that those things they cannot be pulled apart, that you have to address all of these problems as opposed to addressing them one at a time. All right, and of course, that is a button of their convention in 1936 in Chicago. Of course, Frederick Douglass there, which I think is especially ironic if you read the Douglass option piece from a few weeks ago, where Douglass proposes the idea of a biracial working class coalition in the South. It makes perfect sense they would invoke Douglass in the 1930s as sort of representation of what the National Negro Congress stood for. Now, the thing is that as the NNC is being formed, as the CPUSA is making gains amongst Black voters and Black supporters, and as even the NAACP is starting to have to pay some attention to the issues of class and race together, in South Carolina, you do have these issues of Democrats either supporting or opposing the New Deal. Now, throughout most of the 1930s, many Southern politicians backed Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, more so because it's the first time the federal government actually invested in the South. You had a Tennessee Valley Authority, you had the Civilian Conservation Corps, so on and so forth. Efforts to really revitalize the South after decades of economic mismanagement and economic malaise. But despite folks like James Burns and others being ardent New Dealers, at least when it came to issues of economics, not so much of race, you do have some politicians in the South like Ellison D. Smith, aka Cotton Ned Smith, who become stubborn opponents of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs. Now, I only have a limited amount of time, but I do want to mention very briefly that in 1938, by that point, President Roosevelt has won his second term. He won it in smashing fashion, one of the biggest landslides in American history. After 1936, Roosevelt turns his attention to his own party. And he has this idea that, you know, maybe the Democratic Party would be better off if it weren't a party with conservative and liberal wings, that perhaps we should have an all liberal Democratic Party and force the conservatives to go elsewhere. And so in the summer of 1938, Franklin Roosevelt takes the unprecedented step of actually getting involved in Southern Democratic primaries, where he backs the more liberal challengers to Southern stalwarts like your Cotton Ed Smiths. Unfortunately, this plan backfires. President Roosevelt overreaches just a little bit, and it actually provides enough strength for conservatives in Congress not only strengthen their hand, but what you see after 1938 in Congress is a coalition of Southern Democrats and right-wing Republicans in both the Senate and the House, who are going for the next generation or so, do their best to stymie any further liberal or New Deal adjacent legislation in Congress. So, for example, Cecil and Brett talked about the Taft-Hartley Act, other attempts at labor rights and activism in Congress that are pushed back by conservatives in both parties. This is also going to become a major thorn in the side of civil rights legislation in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. If you read your MLK, for instance, in the 60s, he actually writes and talks about this conservative coalition in Congress of both Southern Democrats and right-wing Northern Republicans. Okay. All right. Okay, and by the way, I see Tiffany's point about Henry Wallace. Don't worry, we will get to him very soon. And Jackie, you're right. Again, one thing about communism amongst African Americans is that much of the literature from Black authors in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s does reflect the strength of the Communist Party and the attraction of communism to many African Americans. In the 20s and 30s, you do have prominent Black leaders and Black artists like Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and others who travel to the Soviet Union and talk about the fact that the Soviet Union is a society that, in its constitution, for instance, had an amendment that explicitly banned racism. They talked about the Soviet Union being a place that had solved, in their eyes, the problems of racism and class warfare. And this is, again, going to become appealing to many Black radicals who are trying to find some sort of new framework by which to describe and really create American society. And I can go all night long about the Spanish Civil War and all that stuff and how you see Black Americans getting involved in the fights against fascism all over the world. But suffice to say, like I said before, the fight for civil rights in America is not just a fight in America. They're seeing it as part of a global struggle. Okay. And very quickly answer Elias's question, would this political shift have happened if FDR didn't push for this type of purity? Well, I think you would have still seen a conservative coalition in Congress. It was kind of already there, but FDR's actions partially push it into overdrive. I'm pretty sure they would have built that coalition regardless, because again, in the 1930s, with the New Deal and with the nascent civil rights movement going on, you would have seen attempts by conservatives in both parties try to stymie those things. If not in the late 30s, certainly during World War II. Now, while we've talked about Cotton Ed Smith this evening, it's also important to talk about South Carolina's other senator during this time, James Burns, who is, I think if one were to make a list of most influential politicians in 20th century American history, Burns would be on that list for a variety of reasons. And you can see some of his credentials here. He actually defeats Cole BLEASE in the 1930 Democratic primary. Before that, Burns has served in the U.S. House. He ran against BLEASE in 1924 and narrowly lost, runs against him again in 1930 and wins. And after that, Burns becomes a supporter of the New Deal. He's rewarded by Roosevelt with a seat on the Supreme Court, which he only occupies for just over a year. In fact, it's one of the shortest terms of a Supreme Court justice in American history. He becomes part of the Roosevelt administration during World War II, and later on under President Truman, become Secretary of State, where Burns is going to have a major influence on both the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. And so I want to talk a bit about Burns, because we're going to finish up class this evening by talking about A, the impact of Burns on foreign policy, and B, the impact of Blacks in South Carolina on the civil rights movement growing nationally. So first, I know that Brett is itching to talk about Burns and the bomb. And so I want to turn the floor back over to him for a few minutes, because the story of James Burns and the atom bomb is actually proof positive of how much South Carolina has an impact on global history, not just American history. So, Brett?
Thank you, Robert. I don't want to minimize Burns' impact on not only South Carolina politics, but national politics and international politics by just talking about the bomb. And Jimmy Burns was everything in South Carolina. He worked his way through the legislature, the House seat, the Senate seat, went to Congress, became a senator, and then went on to be a Supreme Court justice, and could have been vice president, except he couldn't come off his really strident segregation position to be palatable enough to be in national office. But there's a really provocative book that I have known for 40 or 50 years now, that there were people that were saying that we didn't need to drop the bombs. We didn't need to drop the bombs on Japan. The war was winding down. Why did we drop the bombs? Why did we drop the bombs? And there's a book about the political biography of James Burns that is it's a big book, and it's called Sly and Able, SLY and Able, about Jimmy Burns. And it puts in print, substantiated for the best I've ever seen, Burns's role in being an arch segregationist, and he was involved now, and we'll get into this later, and we'll talk about it at the deeper dive, in the equalization period, where he was willing to dump lots of money into separate but equal. And so it went from white supremacy to separate but equal, and then we're going to do some, segregation and integration. And so this kind of trickle down liberation of being able to integrate people of color into society. Burns was right there at the throttle. So we know that at the end of World War II, Jimmy Burns was in a position to be referred to as he was Roosevelt's Secretary of State. He was managing the spending of war money, and that when Roosevelt died, he became Truman's brain trust. And that when the discussion came about the end of World War II, we're talking about 1945 now, the question of using the bomb that the Manhattan Project had developed was a very hot topic within all these political circles that were the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the President's office, the White House, and the scientist that had made the bomb. And what I believe and what I'm reading was that Jimmy Burns was the one that turned the thing around. Burns wanted to see the bomb dropped to get the edge on communists. Now, you know that now for quite some time now, communists have been the reason that black people were trying to get freedom. And so we can blame the need to keep black people not free on communists. And so the segue to the enemy being the communist was really mastered by Jimmy Burns in dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 to be able to make the Soviet Union the new evil empire. They were our allies, by the way, but the communists were going to be the new enemy. And so the dropping of the bomb made the race with the at the time the Soviet Union, made them the kind of the arch enemy that was able to taint the movement for black liberation in the United States, which we'll talk a lot more about as we get into the next session, with the smashing of a progressive and multiracial and class conscious militant movement for liberation. And I will put that at Jimmy Burns' feet. Robert, I think that's enough. You want to fill in some blanks there.
Yeah, and you know, the thing about Burns is that I think in terms of the history of South Carolina, he may be most comparable in stature to John C. Calhoun. Both Calhoun and Burns had national profiles, national statures, and some even argued that, like Calhoun, Burns could have entertained notions of being a truly national figure. In 1944, for instance, I know that there was some reference to Henry Wallace in 1948, but in 44, Henry Wallace was FDR's vice president.
Mhm.
And for those who don't know, Wallace was far, he's very much part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party at that point. Um, but there was a feeling amongst the party bosses in 44 that Franklin Roosevelt was not going to survive a fourth term, that he was already pretty sick. He might survive election day, but not much more than that. And so everyone in all the higher ups in the Democratic Party knew whoever his vice president was, if FDR won, was going to be the next president of the United States. And for most officials in the Democratic Party, that could not be Henry Wallace. And so in 1944, there was debate amongst Democratic Party leaders about, well, who should be his next vice president? And James Burns was one of the folks mentioned. However, the problem with Burns was that, as you guys have already alluded to this evening, Burns had made enemies of civil rights leaders, and arguably more importantly from the Democratic Party, he had made enemies of labor unions as well, because they saw that Burns in South Carolina was not exactly the biggest friend of the labor movement. And so that sunk Burns's potential to be the next vice president, which would have made him president in 1945, something I don't want to give too much thought to because that's kind of terrifying. But what is important about Burns, once again, is that eventually Burns would, as Cecil points out in the chat, he'd become governor in the 50s. And we'll talk more about Burns in our next class as well. Burns is one of those figures that in South Carolina history, we unfortunately cannot ignore because of his huge influence on everything in the state even now. As I said before in the Modjeska School, when it comes to the history of South Carolina politicians, it's very difficult to be a national figure while satisfying your base in South Carolina. And I think Burns is actually a chief example of that, along with the Calhoun. Brett?
Well, Robert, before you move on, this is a significant dot I want to connect that the Modjeska School deals with, is the horrible heavy hand on the scale of racial justice that South Carolina has had since before we were a state. And we'll sum it up as we go along, but we can track it up to where South Carolina, a tiny little state with its deep embedded white supremacy, influences not just state policy, not just national policy, but international politics. And Jimmy Burns helps launch that in this more modern era.
I mean, you know, as the saying goes, what happens in South Carolina doesn't stay in South Carolina, for better and for worse. And Tiffany, you're right. Calhoun, Tillman, Burns, Thurman, Atwater, and the list goes on and on. I mean, we have the state is actually important to American world history precisely because it punches above its weight in influencing global opinion on, say, white supremacy, on conservatism, and so forth. And I think James Burns in the 20th century, arguably even more than Strom Thurmond, at least equally with Thurmond, is an example of what that looks like in the 20th century. And I think in the 21st century, we'll see what happens with, say, Lindsey Graham, for example. But you're seeing how South Carolina influences both foreign and domestic policy in a lot of very bad and dangerous ways. Okay. Now, at the same time as World War II is going on, yeah, the list is endless. I've actually joked with historian friends of mine that one day I want to form a 64-person worst politician in Southern history tournament, kind of like the NCAA tournament that's ending this evening. And the problem is there'd be so many South Carolinians and they'd be like their own separate region, but I digress. Anyway, with World War II going on at the same time, what you're seeing in the United States is a renewed effort for human and civil rights. The NAACP, the National Negro Congress, Southern Negro Youth Congress, and many other organizations are joining forces to fight for freedom. The NAACP, for example, during this time period, receives an infusion of hundreds of thousands of new members, thanks to the tireless efforts of organizers, most notably Ella Baker, who emphasizes a more working class based system to really drum up support amongst working class blacks for the NAACP. Up until World War II, the NAACP was seen nationally as a more middle-class organization. But under Ella Baker, who takes over organizing in 1940, and 1943 is really leading the charge to increase working class support for the movement, you see the NAACP grow from 50,000 members in 1940 to, by 1945, over 400,000 members. And you see across the country amongst African Americans this renewed militancy, born not just out of World War II, but out of the experience of the Great War, where they believed at that time that service in the Great War would guarantee greater civil rights, and it didn't. But you see here now that African Americans are tying the war abroad against fascism and Nazism to the war at home against Jim Crow segregation, what many Black Americans refer to as a double V campaign. And as you can see here with the post from the left, you see the NAACP choking out Jim Crow. We look at the bottom of Jim Crow's feet, it has the Nazi and Imperial Japanese flags. But what's also happening during the war is that in the United States, amongst white liberals, amongst other groups, there is also a growing sense that with a war against Nazism raging in Europe, and with white supremacy being tied explicitly to the enemy, is it such a good thing that so many parts of the country embrace a system of segregation that Nazi Germany based many of its laws off of in the 1930s and 40s? You start to see cracks in the segregation system, thanks to the NAA, partially thanks to the NAACP's legal campaigns of the 30s and 40s. Make a very long story short, the NAACP, despite going a more working class direction by the 40s, in the 1930s, under Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP pursues a legal strategy that is designed to attack segregation via the court system. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, but in the 30s and 40s, it starts to pay dividends. For example, in 1944, you have the Smith v. Allwright decision, in which the Supreme Court in an 8-1 decision argues that the whites-only primary, the Democratic Party, was unconstitutional. Now, this is a big deal because in the Deep South, the Democratic Party is the only game in town. If you win the Democratic primary, you're going to Washington, D.C. afterwards. But now, in 1944, cracks are forming in the system. And the Supreme Court says, well, Democratic Party in Texas and elsewhere, you have to allow African Americans the right to actually participate in your primary. So, of course, South Carolina decides, no, we're not going to do that. And instead, the Democratic Party of South Carolina, it quickly, and this shows how powerful the party was in the state legislature comes back into a special session 1944, and passes a law that says Democratic Party is a private entity. It is not a public organization. It is a private entity, and as such can decide who can and cannot vote in our elections. And this is going to lead African Americans in the state, most notably folks like John McCrae and Modjeska Simkins, to create what's called the Progressive Democratic Party. Now, I want to put this in the chat because for those of you who are familiar with the civil rights campaigns of the 1950s and 60s, you have likely heard of what's called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP. Now, the MFDP was formed in 1964. It becomes famous for its attempts to seat delegates at a 1964 convention in Atlantic City, led by folks like Fannie Hamer, Aaron Henry, and others. But 20 years before that, in 1944, at the height of the Second World War, because Americans were fighting for freedom and justice and democracy all over the world, in South Carolina, African Americans formed the Progressive Democratic Party to also fight for delegates at that year's Democratic Convention in Chicago. Now, again, McCrae and Simkins and many activists, men and women across South Carolina, joined forces to create the Progressive Democratic Party. And by the fall of 1944, they have over 45,000 members who registered, ready to go, ready to participate in the democratic process. Now, unfortunately, they don't win those delegates in Chicago. But under McRae, Osceola McCain, and others, they create an apparatus of Black political power that had not been seen in South Carolina since Reconstruction. And it's, again, what I think is especially interesting here is that for generations, white South Carolinians were concerned about the return of Black political power. Well, 1944, those concerns are now starting to see light, again, through things like the PDP and other efforts. And the readings for this week include an article by Sharice Jones Branch about Black women who were heavily influential in building up the grassroots support for the PDP and other groups in the 40s and 50s that, as we're going to see in our next class, are going to become very important to pushing this human rights campaign in South Carolina during the early Cold War years. But to kind of finish up, yeah, it is a great reading. I totally agree with you there. But to finish up tonight's conversation, I want to end on a couple of court cases. One of them, of course, being Elmore v. Rice from 1947, in which George Elmore, an African-American store owner, is going to challenge the Democratic Party's idea of being a private organization. He's going to try to vote. He's going to take it to the courts. And the man you see on the right, Judge Wade's Waring, is going to rule in 1947 in the federal court of South Carolina that actually the Democratic Party's rules are unconstitutional. That, in fact, it is a public organization. You have to allow African Americans the ability to vote in your campaigns. And he says, if you continue to stop Elmore and others from voting, then I'm going to have you arrested. Now, and by the way, Tiffany, I'll get that title for you in just a few minutes as soon as I'm done. But it is on the Modjeska Simkins website. I cannot remember the exact title. I'll get it for you in just a brief moment. But you have Elmore v. Rice in 1947, and then you also have around the same time in 1946, 47, 48, you have to push to desegregate the law school at the University of South Carolina. John Wrighton applies to the law school in 1947. He tries to seek entry into it, but he's denied. Now, here's the thing about that. Remember how at the beginning of class this evening, I talked about how in Plessy v. Ferguson, the idea of separate but equal that was supported by the Supreme Court was that, yes, it's separate. Black and white are separate, but they have to be equal. The problem with that in South Carolina was that, as Wright and NAACP argued, there was no law school for African Americans in the state of South Carolina. And so Judge Waring gives the state government two options, or actually three options. Option one, integrate the law school at USC. And that wasn't going to happen. Option two, create a separate Black law school somewhere else. Or option three, close on the USC law school, and no one has a law school in South Carolina. So the state government, in its infinite wisdom, decides to create a new all-Black law school at South Carolina State University, or South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And this NAACP effort was led by folks like Harold Boulware and others who, in thinking in a context of South Carolina, they're actually thinking, well, at worst, we'll get a Black law school. At best, we might desegregate USC law school, but it likely won't happen. But folks in South Carolina are desperately needing a law school. At that point in the late 1940s, there were only a handful of Black lawyers in the state. And what's going to happen? The grand irony of the Wrighton case is that the creation of a law school at SC State is going to lead to the creation of a cadre of Black lawyers who are going to lead the effort to desegregate South Carolina in the 1950s and 60s. The great irony of that, however, is that their successes are going to lead to the closing of that same law school in 1966. But again, what we're seeing here by the end of World War II, start of the Cold War, is that the battleground is being created in South Carolina for fights on education, on civil rights, on human rights, across every field imaginable. And the early Cold War years are going to play a pivotal role in how the state and the nation deal with civil rights, both in ways that we already know well about, but also in ways that have been intentionally misremembered by many Americans. Okay. So that's it for me. Brett, you have anything to add to that? We can take some questions as well up until 8:30.
Well, no, Robert, that law school class I don't know how many they graduated. It wasn't that many, but they were really movers and shakers in the struggle for Black liberation in South Carolina. I know that Jasper Curitan was the last one. He hadn't finished at State, and he transferred to the University of South Carolina Law School. And I was there at the university when Jasper came in, and Jasper graduated, and he was my attorney the first time I was arrested for intervening in somebody being beaten up, a Black person being beaten up in front of police officers, and Jasper was my attorney then. But he went on to be the Chief Justice of the Appeals Court in South Carolina, is now retired. And there may be some other folks that have some information. I see Marjorie Hammock is paying close attention to us, and she may have something to add. About that time and those people involved, she's shaking her head no. But that we could take questions from the floor now, Robert, if you're willing.
Yes, certainly.
Raise your hand now, folks. Raise your hand.
Amber, I see your hand is raised.
Oh, yes. I just had a question. I remember you were saying earlier about the textile mills and how there were some Blacks who owned textile mills, and I thought that was very interesting. I think sometimes we can argue the theory if racism is a justification of capitalism or not, but I think I had a question is that the owning of textile mills, I think that we could argue that that's black radicalism in itself. Like, but how did that turn out? Like, were there legislation passed to end those mills? How were there any resources about those? Because I'm very interested in that. That's interesting.
Now, I'm glad you asked this question because my colleague, as I mentioned before, she's working on a book about this very thing, and I'm going to tell her tomorrow when I see her at Claflin, say, hey, you got to get that book out there so people can have these answers at the ready. But to make a very long story short, so the textile mills I'm talking about in the Carolinas, they were very much part and parcel of campaigns that were more adjacent to what Booker T. Washington was talking about in terms of Black empowerment economically and the like. The mills, those Black-owned mills, they survived for a while, I think to the 1920s and 30s. But what happens is that the economics of textile mills, more than anything else, really hurts the mills. They just have a difficult time surviving in a very volatile market, especially when you get to the Great Depression era. And so it's really, because the thing is that the state leaders in both states, for the most part, were actually fine with the mills because they didn't see them as a direct threat to white textile mills. They're saying, hey, these mills, again, they're saying, part of the South politics in this time period, in the 1910s and 20s, is this white paternalism of saying, well, if we allow Blacks to have a certain number of mills, businesses, et cetera, if we provide some limited support for those, then we're actually proving the equal part of something but equal to be true. And so even amongst white Southerners, there wasn't universal agreement on what white supremacy should look like. Some folks were saying, let's give them like a few inches here, not the whole mile. Don't give them full equality, but give them a few things here and throw them a bone, so to speak. But you got folks like Coleman BLEASE who are like, give them absolutely nothing. And so these textile mills actually become part of that wider story. What's funny about this, by the way, is that many historians of labor history, up until fairly recently, thought there were no Blacks at all in textile mills. But my colleague has found evidence that A, you have Black-owned textile mills, and there were even some textile mills in the Carolinas that had Black and white workers at them. Not very many, but just enough to raise the interest of both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So, hope that answers your question. Okay. I see Cecil has his hand up. Go ahead, Cecil.
In fact, Dr. Greene, in Charleston, there was a mill, though it was white owned, it was 100% Black labor in the mill. It was the Vesta Mills, VESTA. And in fact, it was owned by Roger Milliken's father, Seth Milliken. Those of you who know who Roger Milliken was, Seth Milliken was the owner of this mill. And the argument was, the logic behind having a completely Black workforce there was to illustrate to white textile mill workers across the state who wanted higher wages, play around, and you may lose the job that you have because we have an entire mill in Charleston running on Black labor. So you organize for higher wages at your peril.
That is an excellent point as to how the people with the money are able to play the workers against each other for color and wages, etc. I didn't know that story. Thank you, Cecil.
And then fast forward to 1956 in Darlington, when the textile workers at Darlington Manufacturing Company voted to organize as a union, and the very next day, Roger Milliken, who owned the mill, shut it down. That was in October of 1956, and they sold it piece by piece in December of 1956 over the objections of the mayor of Darlington and after the employees at the Darlington Mill voted again and voted not to unionize. There were 16 or 18 people who voted yes to continue the union, and Milliken said, so long as there's even one who votes to continue the union, I don't need a mill in Darlington.
Robert, can you mention the organization at the cigar factory in Charleston in 1948?
I mean, you can go ahead and talk about it.
There's a huge building in Charleston that's still a building in Charleston that was a cigar factory. And the workers there shut it down in 1948. And it was the place that I believe was attributed to the starting of the song, We Shall Overcome. But there's been this effort of workers to organize across race lines in South Carolina for an awfully long time. And I'll send out something about the Charleston tobacco strike. Cecil, you're nodding your head. Do you know about that? Okay, we'll find out more about that. Other questions?
Funny enough, I was actually just in that cigar place about a month ago. So yeah, I'm posting in the chat about that cigar factory and the song We Shall Overcome that I think might be of interest to students as well.
Carrie raised her hand.
Go ahead, please.
I was wondering about the progressives in South Carolina in the 20s. I heard Walter Edgar give a talk once about Richard I. Manning, who I think was a progressive governor, if I have that right. But were they, I mean, you said that they had a very mixed record on race. And so I was just curious about that. They weren't the sort of Tillman, I've forgotten the other guy's name, I'm sorry, who was on your slide.
Cole BLEASE.
Cole BLEASE, thank you. They weren't quite in that model, but that didn't mean they were anything to write home about. And I was just interested in that.
Yeah, the progressives and not just in South Carolina either, but the progressives across the country in the 19 teens and 20s, to say their record on race was mixed would be an understatement, to say the least. How I would put it is this. You did have some African Americans, even a few white progressives who supported civil rights. For example, the folks who formed the NAACP, many of them would be considered progressives as well. But there were many progressives who either in the South believed strongly in segregation, or many others who, for instance, embraced eugenics, believed in the idea of there being genuine differences between the races, that sort of thing. And so progressive in the early 20th century does not mean the exact same thing as progressive in the 21st century. In much the same way that liberal doesn't mean the same thing now that it did back then, for example. But Richard Manning, to your point about Richard Manning, in South Carolina, he was a progressive governor in the 19 teens who tried to actually overturn some of what Coleman BLEASE did. He kind of came in to fix the damage of BLEASEism in the state government. But Manning and other progressives in the state, they were really trying to put the issue of race behind them. They were trying to not use it as a wedge issue politically. They tried to move on from it. But the thing about politics in South Carolina is that kind of like in the 19th century, how if you were a politician in the state, you agree with the basic idea of slavery being good. You just disagreed on how to enforce it. In the 20th, if you were a white politician in South Carolina, your idea was white supremacy is good. It's just a question of what it's going to look like on the ground and whether or not we'll enforce it via extra legal means or enforce it through a genteel racism or paternalism and the like.
Thanks.
Oh, no problem. Dr. Goldman, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Now, I just wanted to make the comment in response to the last thing you said. That's the way I see the Republican and the Democratic Party today. One of the things that I always say is that the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is that the Democrats use lubrication.
All right. Okay. So on that note, we got time for one more question before we talk about the deeper dive next week and we adjourn for the evening. Any more questions out there? And please, no questions about lubrication.
Seeing none. Carry on, Robert.
Okay. So I just wanted to mention, so next week, of course,
sorry. Hi. I just like to know what kind of like actual like organizing was taking place before like the Red Scare in the state, right? Like what socialist like pro-black organizing was actually going on here prior to the rise of the whole like.
We'd have to differentiate between the Red Scare of the 19-teens and the Red Scare of the 1940s, but
1950s.
Robert.
1950s.
So Ian, your question is a very good one, which is actually the basis for our next class session, class 4, which is where we're going to really get deeply into how the organizing went. And I gave you a tiny morsel of it this evening when I mentioned the original SNCC, the SNYC, because they become a pivotal force in organizing across the South in the 30s and 40s. The National Youth Congress does the same thing. And I have to kind of limit what I say now because I love this period of American history in terms of the organizing and what's going on. But as you point out, Ian, so much of it is destroyed in the second Red Scare of the 40s and 50s. And in South Carolina in particular, it takes some unique perspectives as well in unique ways that it looks. So for class 4, which is not next Monday, but Monday, April 19th, we'll be getting deeper into what you're talking about in terms of that organizing and what it looked like and what the second Red Scare did. Because the second Red Scare, many historians now agree, second Red Scare probably did more to destroy and hold back civil rights campaigns than anything else in the 40s and 50s. And its impact on American society to this day cannot be underestimated. And we'll get into that on the 19th. Now, next week, we're doing a deeper dive with two very special guests. We have Jennifer Taylor, who is a PhD graduate of the University of South Carolina, to speak in the first hour about memorialization monuments and the Confederacy and how that's memorialized in the generation since the Civil War. And in the second half of our deeper dive, we'll have Millicent Brown, who will talk a bit more about the equalization campaigns. And so next Monday's deeper dive will be a wonderful opportunity to learn more about how the South in the 20th century is taking on these issues of memorialization and Jim Crow segregation in some really unique and interesting ways. And Jean Hammock, I see your hand is raised.
Mute myself. Oh, there. Okay. Can we have the reading for week 3, like next week, even though it's not until the week after that? Because it takes us a while. It took me a while to get through this reading that we had for this week. We needed more than a week. It was a deep, deep dive. It wasn't just a deep dive.
You'll get it later this week. Don't worry about it.
Okay, okay. Thank
Well,
you.
the thing with the readings too is that, as I think I've said before, the Modjeska Simkins class, I can only cover so much in 2 hours. So the readings, I know a week is not quite enough for a lot of folks because you have some things going on with your personal lives and such. But the readings, the hope is that the readings help expand on some things that we may not touch on in class entirely the way we would like to, but they are certainly meant as resources to kind of help you not only stay engaged with the class, but to also find other avenues for learning when the class is over with and done.
Okay,
Gene,
thank
we've
you.
Gene, we've been putting up readings and stocking our study guide with stuff that I've been in every class for 6 years now. I haven't read it all, so this is an ongoing live study here. And see, the thing is, there's new history being made all the time. So just
Absolutely.
keep reading.
And that's
keep reading.
and that's one of the things I'm going to take to my class. They need to know that they can build their own history based on who they are and what they're about.
Definitely, definitely. So it is okay. So I see one last question, and then I think we're going to close it down for this evening. I think some folks will stay behind to talk a bit more after class is officially over. Amari asks, Dr. G, what are your thoughts about the Chauvin trial and potential verdicts mean for Black Lives Matter? So I will just give the following answer. I don't know, and for those who don't know, this is the trial that's related to the murder of George Floyd last year by the police officer in Minneapolis. One would think that this trial should result in a guilty verdict. I mean, if you see someone getting killed on camera, then that should be a slam dunk case. But as we all know, when it comes to police brutality, there is no such thing as a slam dunk case. So I don't know how the case will turn out. I think in terms of Black Lives Matter, though, whether it's a guilty or not guilty verdict, it will certainly be a galvanizing moment for the Black Lives Matter campaign. So we'll see. I kind of get the sense that if you look at the trial right now, it seems like the folks in Minneapolis are trying to make it clear that what he did was clearly wrong, clearly illegal. I think they sense that things in Minneapolis reached a boiling point last year, and they're kind of trying to offer up Chauvin as like a sacrificial lamb. We'll see if that actually happens. I still have my doubts because, well, I'm a Black person in America, so I should have my doubts about all these things. But I digress.
Well, Robert, if there are questions that want to wait until after we hear this closing tune here, that's a very powerful tune written by Leadbelly called Jim Crow Blues. And Daniel, if you're ready, cue that up. And people that have some burning question or criticism, you can stay around for a few minutes after the tune. That sets it up. We've still got a whole bunch of people here. I don't know if y'all got something to say or not. One of the things I'm interested in is difficulty in getting communications from us. We're having more email difficulty in reaching people than in the last, ever since the algorithm of the internet. I think it's a corporate type of thing happening. So I guess if you're here, you got the link, but did you find it in your spam or in your presentation folder for Google? Keith's nodding yes. Well, anyway, you're here and I appreciate it. And if anybody's got anything to say, make your criticism constructive. I want to recognize James DeWeese, who's here, who's the father of Daniel DeWeese, who is working with us now, and I appreciate the family participation. Well, I don't hear anybody wanting to say
Keith
anything.
has his
So
hand raised, Brett.
Daniel?
Keith, go for it.
Thank you. I loved the materials for the class tonight, and though I didn't get all the way through them, like I'm sure a lot of the other people didn't, the labor organization efforts in South Carolina and how it ties in to the segregation, the intentional wedges driven between African Americans and the Caucasian working class. They've done a hell of a good job, haven't they? of dividing us.
Yes, you're correct, precisely correct. And that I've actually had people that were reasonably intelligent college graduates tell me that they thought that unions were illegal in South Carolina. And one of them would be Nikki Haley, who has really campaigned on building her national platform on kicking the ass of the working class, and that it's incredible. That it is really incredible. And I've been in the legislature when there were issues that were pro-worker issues that Gilda Cobb Hunter or Joe Neal might have been the only ones that stood up and spoke in favor of working people, because right outside the door are all the money people. And one of the things that we need to talk about, and as we move past these classes, are 7 classes in people's history, 3 classes in theory, strategy, and tactics. People that want to get deeper into it will be able to take classes that would talk about money and politics. And there you'll find out that 80 plus, depending on what year it is, 80+% of the millions of dollars that goes into financing campaigns in South Carolina is corporate money. And so one of the easy questions to ask is, well, who owns elections in South Carolina or in the United States? And the answer is, who pays for them? And the money that's coming from $200 or less contributions, which is most any of us give, it's like 1 or 2%, 16, 18% self-financing of the candidates. And the rest of it is corporate money. And the bigger corporations, they play both ends against the middle. I know that both the 2 major law firms in South Carolina, both started by Democratic Party governors, the Nelson Mullins Riley Scarborough firm and the McNair firm, they contribute the maximum to everybody, so they don't lose. And so this is the way we run elections in South Carolina and the United States is illegal in most places that call themselves a democracy. And so it's a very tangled web that we have to unravel, but money certainly does have a lot to do with it.
Well, a part of that is the fact that we at no point have had a national turnout that actually amounts to any kind of plurality or majority. Like you have countries like Venezuela that turned out over 80% just in the last 4 years, right? For every single election, just to get people elected. You had people walking from village to village just to vote. And here you have people stuck in a state of constant disenfranchisement or just inability to vote, generally because of work hours or impositions from work, right? Or just life generally, that makes all of that an impossibility. And then you present them with the choices of nothing versus nothing. And then what are you doing to incentivize people to even vote in the first place? We don't have a mandated day to vote. It's just you can go do it if you want.
This is something that will kind of we'll unpack some of these problems as we move through the classes. Then we'll get into solutions as we move beyond that. But you have to remember that the voter registration is a rare thing in an actual democracy. In most of the 27 wealthy democracies, voter registration is a right of citizenship. Everybody gets to vote. Some of them, like Australia, you have to vote or they'll fine you. In the United States of America, we have always used voter registration as an exclusionary tool. Columbia, South Carolina was one of the first places to have a voter registration list, and they nail the names of the white male landowners over 21 years old to the courthouse door, and those are the few people that could vote. And so we now see this resurgence of the new Jim Crow as there's boilerplate legislation. I think there is at least 6 or 7 bills that have been identified as literally boilerplate coming out of the Heritage Foundation that are being introduced in all the states that are designed to reduce participation. And I keep hoping that somebody's going to, that some of the people that don't agree with us are going to realize that the Republicans don't think they can win, so they're just going to prevent people from voting. And that is exactly the way the system is set up. We're going into a redistricting process that happens once every 10 years. The majority party gets to draw the lines. and they draw the lines, and it's legal according to the Supreme Court. They draw the lines to preserve their incumbency. So it's like a self-perpetuating system that has little to do with representative democracy. So we have
Oh yeah.
a very heavy lift, folks, but we got plans for that. Who am I hearing? Miko, I see your mouth moving, but I don't hear no noise.
How about now?
There, better.
Good evening. You know, someone had just recently told me they made a statement that to me that was so profound, and it's like in my brain. But what they said is that there's more people in poverty than in power. And you know, as one of the folks from up north, when it seems like in South Carolina, everybody's just too damn polite, right? So I get vilified. You know, I'm the big evil person in Marion County just because I'm telling people to use their voices. You know, there's people who even consider like pictures with me is like a weapon. You know, if somebody's in a picture with me, then they're down with the cause. And then there's other people, politicians and others, that will call me on the slide, but say, but you know, I can't tell nobody, I'm down with you. It's like, we're never going to get change in South Carolina if all of this, I can't be involved, or all this political politeness, it has to go to the sidelines, or we're going to keep being downtrodden by those with money, because it's just a few of them.
You got that right, Miko. Jean had her hand up, and I see them. Amber, Jean, you're either waving at me or you want to talk.
How about that? You
There
hear
you
me
go.
now? Well, first of all, I want to get with her because I want to help her in any way I can. I don't know anything about South Carolina because I've only been down here a year, but I'm learning fast. So if she needs me, if I can help her in any way, just let her call me.
And listen, I'm putting in the chat. If you text the word change to 313131, anytime we're out on the ground, we send text to let folks know where we can be and what's going on. So I appreciate it. My county is small. My county is 60% African American, and the disenfranchisement is out of control. It's just poverty, obesity, food desert, Wi-Fi desert, you name it, you know?
Yeah.
And so, and the folks that are in power, they don't look like me.
Miko, let me point out before we take Amber is that this is the stuff that we've been working on. Well, the network's 25 years old, came out of an organization that started in the mid-70s, that grew out of organizations that preceded that. So there's a tremendous amount of history that we want to share with this school that will help inform you to be able to be more effective in kicking ass against your problems in whatever county you're in. And we have a really, really well-developed plan in regards to the redistricting that we'll be talking about in different sessions. Amber?
So I'm actually a South Carolina native. I'm a Lancaster native, and I actually moved up to New York and came back down. So I totally understand the frustrations that you have, because we are so, it's polite, but it's also complacency. And so we do have a spirit, I know in my town, and I could be wrong, but just growing up there, seems like there's a spirit of complacency at times. And so it is frustrating, but I think it's not only just disenfranchisement as far as inability and accessibility, but it's also distrust. It's distrust and it's tiredness. People don't trust the political leaders. They're like, what can I do? It's like, what works? I talk to people and they're like, well, I don't want to vote or anything like that because it's no point. So it's like, how do we get that trust back within our communities? How do we want people to change for themselves, and understanding that this is a bigger picture, which is, I think I try to help. I'm a public historian, so I try to get the people to want to know, get Black people specifically to want to know their history, one, and, you know, to say, hey, like we do need to enact change, but just because of the monopolization, we were a Springs town, a mill town, and Springs left. There was nothing left for a lot of people, and Springs didn't the Springs Mills didn't integrate until 1970s, and my papa was lucky to retire, you know, and he worked in the commissary for all his life. So I think it's just a lot, it's complex and many facets, and I'm just here to help, and I'm happy that I was able to sit in on a session with you guys.
It is complex, and I want people that are concerned about the complexity to look at the missingvoterproject.com, which is a website that we've created that deals exactly with the questions that both Amber and Miko have raised. We've been doing the Missing Voter Project since '04, and the thing that we find in the minority community in terms of not voting is they don't think it does any good. And what we do different than the Democratic Party does is we agree with them. It doesn't do any good. It's a damn rigged game. We've got to build a movement outside the system to change the inside of the system.
Yes.
And that's that inside-outside game that is at the core of the progressive networks. I wouldn't say nonpartisan, but I'll say anti-partisan, because the president, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they warned us against parties. There's no parties in the Constitution. Washington said in his farewell speech, you start parties, you're going to end up with two that fight amongst themselves for money and power. I'm paraphrasing. And they forget their mission. And that's exactly what's happened. And so I think that there's enough common sense out there that if we can get people together to agree on the things that we all share, we can make some headway. But we've got all these poor white working class people that have been fed the bill, and they bought it lock, stock, and barrel, basically pretty much starting in the 70s. And Ronald Reagan nailed it. The government's not the solution, it's the problem. And so if you believe the government's the problem, you're not going to take their damn vaccine.
Right.
You mean the places where there is a direct correlation between the countries that have done much better with the COVID thing are places where the government actually helps people. Here, we don't believe the government's going to help you. And so we don't believe the government. And so you've got this repression of the working class white vote because they don't believe in the government, and the repression of the working class black vote because it actually doesn't work for them. And so we've got our plate full, but we have been dealing with this, and we have some plans, and we would love to share them all. We do missingvoterproject.com. Another question?
If you know about the Lava Jato project, you see this tale kind of come forth of like Bolsonaro was put into power, right, as a collaborative effort with Obama first taking out his predecessor, right, creating the context for Bolsonaro to come in, and then you have Trump sending his advisor Bannon in to make sure that Bolsonaro was going to be on his side as soon as possible. So you know that's just a really good example of like you have this entire country of millions of people, a massive country with huge ramifications for Latin America, right? And you have this collaborative project between these two completely, you know, supposedly opposed presidents that just came together to make sure that this happened.
Yes, that's called the power of capital, and that there's
Oh yeah.
When you look at the national conventions, you'll notice they're all sponsored by the same people. Like I said, the largest contributors financially bet on both parties, and so that's an old story. And let's move towards wrapping this up. Anybody got something else to share with people? But bear with us as we kind of peel back the layers of the onion as we go through the 7 classes of people's history, and then we get into the analysis and the theory and the practice. And the analysis is sums this stuff up, and we talk about why it's happening, who benefits from it. And one of our guests in the latter portions of the thing is Lewis Pitts, who was one of the founding members of the Project on Law, Corporations, and Democracy. And 20 years ago, there's a group of lawyers that started an effort to be able to speak against the personhood of corporations. And it's a phenomenal story about the way corporations have gone from being something that the founding fathers warned against. Jefferson said, God forbid we not strangle the corporations in their infancy. that we've gone from warning against that to them actually running the show. And so I hear your frustration, but we're gonna unpack this thing in a rational, kind of linear way. Mr. Fox, you got your hand up, and then Gene, and we're gonna wrap it up after that.
Yeah, I was just going to dovetail what I said at the start of the class on the question of the legacy of voter suppression and that kind of being imbued into the DNA of the Black voter. I'm an honorary South Carolinian at this point. I've been here 30 years. But when I first got here, I was one of those Yankees and like, y'all this, y'all that. And why do y'all look at it this way? And when what resonated with me earlier was when you were talking about the outside agitator and how that whole term and evolution of what that means came to be. And I think we got to be mindful of the local neighborhood politics and the traditions that are in some of those communities. So I don't agree with like the lack of disengagement or the fear, but I could understand it because there are, if you get marked as a rabble rouser or just, intelligent or whatever it is, from seeing how it works in public school and how they try to discourage kids from going, beyond a certain IQ performance, to seeing how the community functions to keep everything the way it is. And then if you get blacklisted and, just what that means, not everybody's built for working outside of the system. Some people do want to participate in the system or work in public schools or work wherever they're going to encounter those kinds of people that can have it out for them. So I think just us as Modjeska graduates and future graduates, we have to know the terrain, know how to penetrate some of those neighborhoods and be able to create safe spaces for people to check in and get their political education. As simple as the Missing Voter Project is you're not going to get it in public school, because even in the civics classes that they do have, they don't want that kind of citizen or graduate operating in South Carolina. And I just think that we're in an interesting time and space, next door with Georgia turning blue, and then the backlash of how the Republicans are going really hard and making it. So I actually looked at the bill and the policy. So it's easier for the less populated places to vote and harder for people in the more populated places to vote, and any number of things that they're doing with that. But backlash is a real thing. So it's like, how do we as organizers solve that puzzle so that people have the courage to engage? Because I'm always fascinated with what's the key to unlock the 500,000 Black voters. I know Ian and some other folks chimed in earlier, but I don't think it's just as simple as they don't have, they're totally disenfranchised, or they don't have, I forgot what the other words are. I think it's a systemic and much deeper problem that's in the DNA of Black people that we have to really figure out and support them through to get them out of the trauma to engage the system.
Gene, you're up.
That was fantastic. I think that so encapsulates where Black people are. We have to walk in two worlds always. And somebody has to point out to Black people that makes us better, because we have to walk in those two worlds. We have to understand both worlds, and we have to know how to navigate both worlds.
That's profound, Gene, and I'm of little color, but I know that when I threw down for truth, justice, and the American way as I was raised, they beat me up and put me in jail. And so
Yeah.
we've got to do what it is that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about and Modjeska worked around, which is building a movement of people that share
Yes.
some kind of common good.
Yes.
And we continue to be divided into silos. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to connect the dots between those silos and understand what the
Yeah.
causal factor of the different natures of oppression are.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree.
We will continue beating that drum, and it's really wonderful that we've got people to listen. And really, seriously, doing the school would be no fun at all if you weren't there. And it's really, I feel like this is finally something that has some resonance in terms of actually planting seeds that grow, and not just like protesting. There's like you chasing
Yes.
ambulances and protesting this event, and that event. We've got to build a movement. It's going to take some time. And
Yep.
I'm really sorry, because I was a revolutionary back in the 60s that thought the revolution was right around the corner. And all we had to do was raise more hell and break more windows. It didn't work. And so we have to be a little bit more thoughtful.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the reality is that Omari just pointed out, there are literally 500,000 registered black voters that are regularly not turning out.
Yes.
In the last like 5 election cycles, the governor's been elected by less than 127,000 votes. And so if
Yes.
we can, this Missing Voter Project, if you go read this 4-page proposal we put out before 2020 that didn't quite catch because we don't have enough oomph to
Yeah.
get it out there. But that if we were able to convince those people that we agree with them, their vote doesn't count because the gerrymandering is so rigged, that if all the black people voted in the districts they're in now, it wouldn't change a thing because they wouldn't get any more votes in the
Right.
legislature or in
Right.
Congress. But there's only one district in South Carolina that can't be gerrymandered, and it's the one that Ben Tillman expressly was concerned about when he wrote the Constitution we're operating under, and it's the statewide district, because Ben knew that the black people could elect the governor. That's the reason that South Carolina is the most legislative state in the nation. So the secret to the power is the answer to the reason that Tillman wrote the Constitution. We will continue to unpack that secret, so stay tuned, boys and girls.
I will. I will.
That's all I got, folks. Let's go
Good night.
do what it is that we do when we get out of class or whatever it is. I don't want to know, but go have a good time.
I have one question.
Me too.
Becky's got a
Yeah.
question. Hold
Yeah,
on.
I want to know when Amber's running for president. I'll be your campaign manager.
Vote early, vote often is all I can say. Amber just got back, okay? Give her time to get her feet on the ground.
Okay.
Okay, but it's the comebacks that we need, Amber. Thank you for coming back. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Omar. I appreciate it, brother. Gene, good night. Chris, Keith, you're a blessing. Bye-bye.